This video will be all about creating and making synth sounds. But while I usually make those videos about, for example, making some Prophet type synth pad sound or some classic bass sounds, here I'm going to focus on the top 3 mistakes that you can make while creating sounds with your synthesizer. Those will be fully based on my own experience because I've been doing this for a few years now, and I'm also completely self-taught to the field of synthesis and sound design, and I absolutely love it. Like, it's really one of my favorite things to just create sounds and to find your own kind of language through sounds. Nevertheless, there have been moments that have been really messy, where I just now, when I look back at them, know I was just focusing on the wrong things. And I think those are important because you learn the most when you do something wrong. But also it helps to sometimes hear from other people what their mistakes were, what they think were their biggest kind of obstacles when it came to creating synthesizer sounds. And that's why I want to share this with you in the hope that it can help you to get a little closer to whatever sound you're trying to achieve with your synthesizer. And before we start, let me quickly say hi. So my name is Yannis, and as I mentioned already on my channel, you can find videos about making synth sounds, but not only. It's generally about creative music production, giving you tips and tricks on how to have basically more fun making and producing music. So in case you like this video, you're already warmly invited to check out the other videos that you can find on my channel. So let's start with number 1, which is the feeling that you think you constantly have to use every single setting that your synth is offering to you. So it basically means that you can't stand the feeling of not using some LFO, that you can't stand the feeling that while your synth offers 3 oscillators, that you're only using 1. And I think here it also makes sense to bring in some cooking analogy. I think it's the first time I use some cooking analogy here, although it feels like everybody's constantly doing this in music. So just imagine that you're cooking some dish at your kitchen and you just can't stand the feeling of not using some spice. So maybe you're cooking something where you know curry would be weird, but then you're like, no, but I have this nice curry, I still have to use it, so you also add it, and your meal isn't necessarily getting better through it. It's just your own feeling of missing out on something that you have and you feel like you should always use it. And this was totally what I was thinking when I started making synth sounds. So I had this microcorg. It was my first synth with which I was really trying to learn about synthesis. And every time I made a sound, I just went through the whole menu and tried to do something everywhere. I couldn't stand the feeling of not using some effects, and there were 2 oscillators, and to me it was weird to only use 1 oscillator. I was like, okay, if I have 2, before I just don't use it, there must be something great I can add with the 2nd oscillator. And overall I just thought that if a synth sound is great, it must be really complex, so there must be many modulations applied, and also maybe you have some software synthesizer where you have this kind of matrix where you can apply basically everything on everything. I thought this matrix must be used fully in order to use the full potential of the synthesizer and make those sounds really great. But then I also went through some patches I liked that were already on the synthesizer and saw that they were really simple. So sometimes it was just like 1 oscillator, a little bit of filter, a little bit of envelope, no effect, but it sounded great. And I think that's a big step to just accept that simple things can also sound great, because synthesis can seem really abstract, lots of different words, lots of possibilities, and if there are lots of possibilities, I feel like subconsciously you always feel like it must be really complex, and if I do something that is really simple, it probably isn't good because it's too simple for the complexity that is theoretically possible with this synthesizer. But there's so much to explore if you just focus on the single sound of the oscillator, then bring in the filters, see how it reacts to each other, how the resonance reacts. Then you bring in the envelopes, and without even bringing in LFOs or effects, there's just so much to explore, also because every synthesizer reacts a little differently, that after a while I really started appreciating doing this. And what really helps me in order to get rid of this feeling of missing out is that if you have a synthesizer, it's usually yours. I mean, maybe you borrow it, but let's think now that it's your synthesizer. So there will be many sounds that you can create with it, and it's not going to leave you or it's not going to run away from you. So if you don't use any LFOs on one sound, or if you only use one oscillator on one sound, there will still be more chances in the future where you can use two oscillators once it's the time for it, or once it's a fit with the music. But there's the right time for everything, and it's okay to not do everything all the time. By the way, if you're still new to this whole world of synthesizers, and while it's really fun and fascinating, you still feel like quickly confused by those words and terms, I want to invite you to check out a full class that I made specially designed for just teaching you the very basics of synthesis. It's available on Skillshare, which is generally a super cool place for finding classes about creative subjects, also for example filmmaking or drawing, or for example music. And if you use this link that you can find down below in the description, you can get your first month on Skillshare for free. So let's move on to mistake number 2, which is overdoing stereo. And maybe you can just ask yourself the question now, if you ever think of your synth sound in terms of, is it a mono sound or is it a stereo sound? Because if you're working with the DAW especially, there's a high chance that all your synth sounds will always be in stereo. And with like hardware synths, I mean, you can have a mono synth, so you don't have this problem because you can only send basically one audio signal to your interface. But inside your DAW, you can always add immediately some stereo effects, some stereo chorusing, maybe even some panning with the oscillators. And if you're using presets, there's also a high chance that they are already drowned in stereo effects like chorus, delay or reverb. And don't get me wrong, those effects can all sound really amazing, but there's one very important difference between listening to a sound alone and listening to a sound that is going to be part of a bigger arrangement. Because if you're making some solo synth piece, you can do whatever you want because it's not going to interfere with something. But if you're looking for some pad sounds to add to your music, and let's say you don't want to just use one pad sound, you have 4 different pads that do some different functions as some type of layered pad. And now all of them probably have some stereo effects, so some wide chorus, some delay, some reverb, all of them have their own reverb. And chances are that if you listen to this as a whole, first of all, it's going to be some indistinguishable soup of content because something's just everywhere, but there's not really a good separation. And also, once you change to mono, most of it is going to disappear. And in those situations, what really helps for me is to make all those sounds narrower. So maybe inside your synth plugin, you can already pick either like a mono setting, or you can just decrease the stereo width. Or in your DAW, you will always find some effect like in Ableton, the utility effect. It's definitely one of the most useful ones, where you can either switch to mono or just make the signal a little less wide. And you should never make it wider, by the way, or at least unless you have a very good reason. But here you can also just make it narrower, so it's still a little stereo, but just not like all over the place. And just try to take off those individual effects, especially like stereo delay and stereo reverb. You can keep a bit of chorus, and then try to just place those elements like as a mono sound. So maybe one synth pad is on the right side, another one on the left side, and the other one's kind of in between in those middle positions. And then you send all of them into one reverb that is adding the kind of stereo field, but also gives a little depth to the sounds and glues them together. And it's so important to remember that some interesting stereo image is not created by just piling up 10 stereo sounds, but by having small elements that maybe by themselves don't always sound super amazing, but that together just create this excitement. So you should ask yourself every now and then, like, how much stereo do I need at the time, and how much do I use, and also what am I going to use the sound for. And I think by having this awareness, you will be way more efficient in creating your sounds and save yourself from those bad surprises later, hearing stuff disappear or just being this indistinguishable soup. So let's move on to mistake number 3, which is that you don't spend enough time with your synthesizer. And now you might be like, okay, seriously, this banal? And I know, but I also believe that in all those creative things, most of the time the solution to having more fun is rather banal and simple. And I absolutely love the fact how easy it is to get into music production, how affordable it is, and that basically everybody can start doing something nowadays. But there's one downside, which is that you're totally in touch with the internet, also for being on YouTube, watching a video like this, for example, and getting some idea on what you can do, learning about stuff. And after a while, you're also in touch with all those companies because you research what kind of brand you get or what kind of plugin you get, and maybe you're signed up for some newsletter or you get some advertisements, all this kind of stuff, or social media. And everybody constantly wants to sell you some better synth. And you can be super confused in thinking of, okay, maybe my synth isn't good enough, I need something else, and then you see something new popping up and you're like, but maybe I should stop learning with this synth because this synth is better. And you're in this constant loop of questioning if you're actually having the right gear. And I think that here it was a big advantage, like back in the days without internet, that you would just buy your first synthesizer. I mean, back then probably they would have been also really expensive, but let's just take the good part of it. So you would have your nice synthesizer and you just have your manual basically and the synth, and there you go, you learn it, and you won't hear about anything else that could distract you. And I think if you can manage to get into that state, you will benefit from it so much, because maybe there's a better synth. It's totally possible. I mean, obviously when I had my microcork, there were better synths. But still, I was for a while making sounds with it every day, and this way just learned the basics of synthesis and how things worked. And I think if you can manage to get to maybe knowing 80% of what's theoretically possible with your synth, or what kind of knob is doing what, that's such a big achievement. And if you reach this point with whatever you're having, be it a plugin or some little hardware synth, you'll always make way more engaging and interesting music than some person that just had a lot of money and had spent this money into some vintage synth or some crazy modular system, but didn't invest time, because the investment of time, I think, is also way more important than the investment of money when it comes to making synth sounds. And I also experienced a lot that musicians were judging really quickly whether they like a synth or not. And I don't think you should be like that. So for example, when I was for the first time trying my Performer, I went to this big music store here in Berlin where you can try synthesizers, and it was a full mess. Like, I was pressing some buttons on there was a MIDI keyboard connected, but like it was either out of tune, having some weird movement, or I just didn't manage to get to any good sound. So if I would judge quickly, I'd be like, no, this is way too complicated and it's also so bulky and no. But then I've seen YouTube videos of people doing actually cool things with it, and I was like, okay, I mean, maybe it's just this type of instrument where you need some more time to get into. And I'm so happy I did, because now it's just one of the most amazing instruments I ever had, maybe the most amazing one. And still I'm not bored at all by it. And it only came over time. I needed a while to get into it, but it paid off. And I think with synthesizers, you should always give them a little time before you make your final judgment. And once you've reached this point of understanding the instrument by about 80%, it's totally fine to say, okay, now I see something that looks like a better fit for myself, but also this new instrument you're going to learn quicker because you went through the process already with what you have currently. And also you kind of earned yourself this thing because you sticked to one thing and you gave it proper time, and now you also have that much knowledge with this instrument that you can also say, okay, I know it, I can make some good decision, and it's not just some emotional weird, I've seen some video, I've heard one song where one song was great type of judgment. And those were my 3 mistakes, but I'm really curious to hear about your mistakes. So what kind of things you ran into, or what kind of obstacles you faced while creating synth sounds. Be warmly invited to share all of those in the comments down below. And if you now feel like you actually want to learn how to create some type of synth sound, there's one video here about some Prophet type synth pad sound with Ableton Live's analog synth, and some other tutorial here about making some classic bass sounds with Ableton's wavetable synth. Apart from that, I wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye!